A long time ago, when I was teaching this course that I developed over a few decades called Maps of Meaning, I put forward the proposition that your experience is made, you can subdivide your experience into two components at the broadest level. It's yin and yang to some degree, but another way of thinking about it, a more concrete way, is known and unknown. There are things you know, and there are things you don't know. Now, here's the definition of know. It isn't that you have a description of it. You know a place when what you want to happen happens there when you act. That's how your brain reacts to a known situation. So when you're somewhere familiar, the reason it feels familiar is because everything you do works. And that's one of the nice things about being home. You know where everything is. Everything's simple, assuming your house isn't an absolutely chaotic hellhole, which it might be. But if you set it up well, it's familiar and comforting because everything you do there works. And so you feel secure there, like you should, because everything you do there works. But then you can go out beyond the domain of what's kind and familiar, and you can go to places where you don't know how to match your behavior with the demands of the situation, and that's in the unknown. And you might say, well, why bother going to the unknown at all? And there's a variety of answers to that. Is, well, do you want to just stay in your house? And the answer to that's probably no. And second, the unknown has an uncanny ability to come into your house even if you don't invite it, which is the motif, by the way, of the serpent in the garden, right? No matter how carefully you set up the walled garden, you're not going to keep out all the snakes. And so you better be prepared to deal with snakes, even if you're on familiar ground. And the way you learn to deal with snakes is by going out and interacting with snakes. And so then your safety isn't dependent on security, right? Which is an impossibility in any case. Your stability starts to become dependent on your competence, and that's a way better deal. In order to move out into the world and to become competent, you have to make friends with what you don't know. And this is the opposite of being a totalitarian. So if you're relying on security to regulate your emotions, you're going to insist that what you know is right. Because if it's not right, then you get anxious and upset. And if you're anxious and upset, you have no tools. But if your security isn't dependent on what you know, but is dependent on your ability to handle snakes, let's say, your ability to deal with the unknown, then you can welcome the unknown. And so why should you do that? Well, first of all, you're not going to escape from it because it's going to come visit you at home, no matter how secure you are. Even if you just stayed at home, at some point you're going to get ill. And then, well, in come the snakes. And if you're not prepared for that, well, all hell's going to break loose. And so there's no final security in being a human being, insecurity, which is why tyranny and authoritarianism, mindless rule following is insufficient, even though careless rule breaking is also not helpful. So what you want to do is welcome the unknown with open arms, because it can teach you and change you, and it can teach you the things you don't know, and it can change you into what you could be. And so then you think, well, maybe what I don't know is my friend. Now, you might ask yourself, well, is what I don't know my friend? And here's the answer to that question. To what degree are you living in paradise? If your life is not everything it could be, and I mean everything it could be, then hopefully the reason for that is that you're wrong. And that'd be great if that was the reason, right? Because if the world's wrong and that's why you're miserable, you're done, because that's the world and there's just you. And if it's the world making you miserable, you're pretty much doomed. But if it's your own stupidity and your own ignorance, your own blindness, your own malevolence, then at least in principle, even though this wouldn't be easy, at least in principle, you could do something about that. And so what you do in some sense, and this is why Christ says, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, is because they've opened themselves up to the possibility of revelation. Knock and the door will open. Ask and you will receive. Seek and you will find, which seems wildly optimistic, but which has a real point, which is that the manner in which the world manifests itself to you is dependent to an indeterminate degree on what you aim for and how much you're willing to sacrifice to attain that. And I mean that technically as well, because when you look at the world through an ethical hierarchy, because you have to prioritize your perceptions. You have to decide what's most important, because that's what you look at. Because what else would you look at? What's least important? And so with every act of your movement of your eyes and with every attempt to focus your attention, say on a conversation in a restaurant when there's all sorts of other conversations going on, you're making decisions about what's most important. And so if what's most important is opening yourself up to revelation, then you're going to put yourself in a position where that's a possibility. So one of the things I recommended to people who are trying to develop a vision for life, and this is a meditative exercise or even a prayer, is, and we could put it in biblical terms for the purposes of this lecture. So imagine that you can have what you want and you need, but you have to know what it is. And you have to be willing to let go of whatever's necessary to let go of to move in that direction. And the more you're willing to let go, and that's a sacrificial motif, the more you're willing to give up to move in that direction, the higher the probability you'll move in that direction. And the more clear your vision is with regards to what you want, the higher the probability. Well, that makes perfect sense, right? How are you going to orient yourself towards something if you don't know what it is? And how are you going to attain something difficult if you don't put in the requisite effort? No one with any sense would ever presume that either of those things were possible without doing both of those things. And so the exercise asks you to spend 15 minutes, first of all, imagining, okay, here's the deal. You get to have what you want and you need in 5 years from now, within the bounds of reasonable rationality, right? But who knows what that is, because God only knows how far you could go in 5 years if you were all in. You can go a long ways. But let's be reasonable about it. You can make another plan in 5 years if you're radically successful. If you could have what you wanted, what would it be? And it's a bit of a vague question, so we ask people to answer it more specifically. What would you want in an intimate relationship? What would you want in friendship? What would you want in your job or your career? How might you educate yourself? How would you take care of yourself mentally and physically? What would you do with your time outside of work? Remember, you get to have anything you want here within the bounds of your limits, let's say, and even the limits of your imagination. Just what would that look like? Well, that's an opening up to revelation. You think, well, you're asking yourself this question. Well, that's an interesting thing, right? It's like, why do you have to ask yourself a question if you could hypothetically generate the answer? Why isn't the answer just there? And the answer is, we don't know why. But it's clearly the case that you can ask yourself a question and then you can get an answer. That's what happens when you think. That's the revelatory element of thinking. And we think up those answers. But the religious presumption is something more like, well, no, the thoughts enter the theater of your imagination because you've opened yourself up to the revelation, and that isn't you in any real voluntary sense. In some sense, it's almost as if it's something external to you because you didn't have the answer, and you posed the question, and now you have the answer. And you know how that works too, because you can get an answer that manifests itself internally, and sometimes it clicks, right? It's intuitively appropriate. It matches you in some fundamental way, and you think, oh, yes, of course. And well, that's a revelation. And then that's part of thought. First part, ask yourself a question. The second part, receive an answer. The third part, dissect and analyze the answer and maybe compare answers and maybe do that in dialogue with other people. And that's thought. But all of that's predicated on the initial openness to the receipt of the revelation. And so this is such a cool idea that the more of your own ignorance and insufficiency you're willing to admit, and that's a painful thing, right? If you go right down to the core of why you're much more useless than you might be, you go right to the core of that, the deeper you go down, and that's in some real sense an admission of your sins and inadequacies, the more likely it is that you'll receive an answer that will rectify that. And I think, well, that's the first line. I think that's literally true. I think that's almost all you do in psychotherapy, for example. It's like, what's wrong with my life? Now, some of that might be, you've been terribly hurt by other people, but maybe you need to fortify yourself so that won't happen anymore. And you may have all sorts of physical and psychological problems that are intrinsic to you, but it's still the same issue. You still have to contend with those weaknesses, and you've probably multiplied them stupidly in all sorts of ways. And so you got to put yourself down, not in a demeaning sense, but you have to strip yourself of all your presumptions and your pretensions especially when you're dealing with the worst problems that you face, because the worst problems you face are in some sense directly proportionate to the most blind that you are, right? Or God, wouldn't it be lovely if that was the case, that was the reason you had serious problems, is because that's where you're most blind. It makes sense, eh? Because you'd be most afraid there and also most unwilling to take remedial action. And so you really have to humble yourself. And it's supposed to be a private act too. This isn't something you do and sort of expose your vulnerability to other people, although there might be circumstances under which that's appropriate. You're really doing that for yourself. Like, what the hell's wrong with me exactly? And that's a terrifying thing too, because that means you have to admit to yourself that you are unhappy. And that's the first thing a tyrant does, by the way, is forbid you to be unhappy. And so you might be a tyrant to yourself in that regard. You have to admit to yourself the depths of your misery and your longing and the bitterness that might go along with that. And then you have to associate that with all your insufficiencies and your errors. And that might involve a real detailed analysis of your past. That's something like a confession of sins. And the more you do that, and this is literally the case, the more open you are to a corrective revelation. And so Jung, Carl Jung, the great psychoanalyst, he said, modern people don't see God because they don't look low enough. And that's worth thinking about for the rest of